Margaret had never been one for many words, especially after the death of her granddaughter, Emily. Every evening, like a sacred ritual, she walked the familiar path to the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. The path, lined with ancient willows that whispered in the wind, felt like a procession of silent condolences. The cemetery had become Margaret's refuge, a place where she could feel close to Emily, hoping to fill the unbearable void left by her loss. One chilly autumn afternoon, as the shadows lengthened across the ground, Margaret noticed something different. A young man, no older than a teenager, sat cross-legged beside Emily's grave. He was wrapped in an oversized coat, his gaze fixed intently on the headstone. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, a mix of curiosity and unease flooding her thoughts. She had never seen this boy before. Who was he? And what was he doing near her granddaughter's resting place? Her steps faltered, her cane tapping against the gravel, but she forced herself to continue. As she neared the grave, the boy looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a depth that seemed beyond his years. His expression was serious, almost solemn, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She cleared her throat, her voice cracking from disuse. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. The boy hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully, before he finally spoke. "My name is Thomas." His voice was soft, almost melodic, but the name meant nothing to Margaret. She had no idea who he was or why he was here. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick with unasked questions. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together this young stranger's presence. Was he a distant relative? A friend she had never known about? Or was this all some strange coincidence? Thomas continued to study her, his expression inscrutable, as if he was judging whether he could trust her with whatever burden he carried. After what felt like an eternity, he broke the silence again. "I used to come here with my father," he began, a note of sadness creeping into his voice. "He told me about Emily, said she was someone very special." Margaret's confusion deepened. The boy spoke as if he knew Emily intimately, mentioning things that only someone close to her would know. Her love for the sea, despite living far from the coast, and the way she would laugh at the smallest things. It was as if this boy had a window into parts of Emily's life that Margaret had never seen. Each word he spoke felt like a puzzle piece falling into place, but the picture that emerged was one she couldn't fully understand. Emily had always been a quiet girl, keeping her thoughts to herself. How could this stranger know her so well? A knot formed in Margaret's chest, a mixture of confusion, fear, and a growing sense of unease. The cemetery, once a place of comfort, now felt charged with a tension she couldn't shake. Who was this young man, really? And why did he seem to know more about her granddaughter than she herself did? The questions gnawed at her, demanding answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. But as Thomas continued to speak, revealing more about his mysterious connection to Emily, Margaret realized that she had no choice. Whatever secrets he held, she needed to hear them. She needed to understand the parts of Emily that had remained hidden from her all this time. Margaret gripped her cane tightly as she listened to Thomas. Each word he spoke seemed to pull her deeper into a world she had never known existed. The young man spoke of Emily with such familiarity, recounting small moments, like the way she would lose herself in the pages of a book on rainy days or how her laughter would fill the room when she watched old comedies. These details struck Margaret like arrows, piercing through the cold distance she had always felt between herself and her granddaughter. How could he know these things? "She never told me about you," Margaret finally muttered, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile connection they were building. Thomas looked down at the ground, a shadow crossing his face. For a moment, he seemed even younger, more vulnerable, as if the weight of whatever he carried was too much for him. She probably wouldn't have," he replied, a hint of sadness in his tone. "Emily kept a lot of things to herself. I guess she thought it was better that way." He glanced back up at Margaret, and she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or something deeper. It stirred a fear within her that she couldn't quite name, a fear that maybe, just maybe, this stranger knew things about her granddaughter that she might not be ready to hear. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice firm but laced with a hint of desperation. "Why now, after all this time?" Thomas's expression softened, and he seemed to weigh his response carefully, as if his words held the power to change everything. "I think you deserve to know," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I think she would have wanted you to know, even if she couldn't tell you herself." He hesitated, then added, "I feel like, maybe she wanted you to understand what she couldn't say." The air between them felt charged, the silence heavy with unspoken truths. Margaret's mind spun with questions, each one more urgent than the last. What was Emily hiding? Why had she kept so much of herself hidden, even from her own grandmother? And why did this young man, this Thomas, seem so certain that he knew her better than anyone else? She felt a flicker of anger rising within her. Anger at Thomas for speaking as if he understood her granddaughter more than she ever could, and anger at herself for not knowing how to break through Emily's walls when she had the chance. "You don't know me," she said suddenly, the words sharper than she intended. "You don't know what it's like to lose someone and realize you never really understood them at all." Her voice trembled, and she fought back the tears that stung at the corners of her eyes. Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her pain. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't know what it's like to be you, but I think Emily wanted you to know her better, and I think that's why she brought me here." Margaret's heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver running down her spine. "What do you mean, she brought you here?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of sadness and something like determination. "She told me things," he said simply, "things she couldn't tell anyone else, and now, I think it's time for you to hear them." Margaret struggled to find her voice, her mind racing with the implications of Thomas's words. What did he mean, "She brought me here"? How could Emily have possibly orchestrated any of this? She had been gone for so long, leaving behind only the echo of her absence in Margaret's life, yet, here was this stranger, speaking as if he were some kind of messenger, sent to deliver truths that Margaret had missed. Thomas, as if sensing her turmoil, lowered his gaze to the headstone. He gently brushed a fallen leaf from its surface, the motion almost reverent, before he spoke again. "She used to talk about you a lot, you know," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She always wondered if you'd ever understand why she kept so much hidden. She hoped you might, one day, even if it took a long time." Margaret felt a pang in her chest, the familiar ache of regret. Her grip tightened around the handle of her cane until her knuckles turned white. She had thought of herself as strong, stoic in the face of loss, but now she felt raw, exposed. "If she wanted me to understand, she should have told me herself," Margaret replied, her voice wavering between bitterness and sorrow. "Why did she need you to do it?" Thomas met her gaze, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, perhaps pain, perhaps empathy. "Maybe she didn't know how," he offered, his words lingering in the chilly air. "Or maybe she thought she was protecting you from something, but there were things she couldn't carry alone, things she thought, maybe you deserved to hear, even if it's painful." Margaret stared at him, trying to read the truth in his expression, but his face remained a mask of solemnity. She couldn't tell if he pitied her or if he, too, was struggling under the weight of whatever secrets he held. The wind rustled through the willows, filling the silence between them with a soft, mournful whisper, as if the trees themselves mourned the unspoken words between Margaret and her granddaughter. Thomas took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he seemed to gather the strength to continue. "She used to come to this place often, even when no one knew. It was her refuge, I think, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts and with her memories of you." He paused, glancing at Margaret as if gauging her reaction. "But she wasn't always alone when she came here." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, the intensity of her curiosity pushing aside her earlier doubts. "What do you mean? Did you meet her here?" Her voice was sharper now, tinged with urgency. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression becoming distant, as if he were looking back on a memory that had grown blurry with time. "Yes," he said quietly, "I met her here, many times. She would sit under that old tree over there, the one by the path, and write in her notebook." She said the sound of the leaves reminded her of the ocean waves, the way they whispered and sighed. He smiled faintly, a sad, wistful smile. "She missed the ocean, you know, even though she hadn't seen it in years." She said it made her feel free. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She remembered the way Emily's eyes would light up when she spoke of the sea, how she would talk about its endless horizons as if it were a place she could escape to in her dreams. But she had never known that Emily had come here, to this quiet, unremarkable cemetery, to find a semblance of that freedom. She swallowed hard, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Why didn't she tell me she came here?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of anger and desperation. I could have been here with her." Thomas's gaze softened, and he shook his head slowly. "I think she thought this was something she had to do alone, but she wasn't as alone as she thought, Margaret. There were moments, small moments when she wished you were here, too. She just didn't know how to ask." He hesitated, as if struggling to put his thoughts into words. "She always seemed like she was carrying a weight, like there was something inside her that no one else could see." The words struck Margaret like a physical blow, and she felt herself sag under their weight. She had always thought of Emily as distant, yes, but she had never imagined that her granddaughter was carrying such a heavy burden. one that she had hidden behind polite smiles and quiet evenings, and now, faced with the knowledge that she had missed so many signs, she felt the crushing weight of regret settling in her chest, but beneath the regret, a new determination stirred. She turned to Thomas, her eyes burning with a desperate need to understand. "You seem to know so much, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling but filled with a newfound resolve. "If you know what she couldn't tell me, then you need to tell me everything. No more secrets." Thomas met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment, as if he were weighing the decision in his mind. Then he nodded, slowly, as if coming to a conclusion. "There's more you need to hear," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But you have to promise me, Margaret, you have to promise that you'll listen until the end, even if it's hard, even if it hurts." Margaret felt a chill pass through her, but she steeled herself, setting her jaw in determination. "I promise," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll listen to whatever you have to say, no matter what." Thomas nodded again, and there was a weight in his eyes, as if he knew that the words he was about to speak would change everything. The wind picked up, swirling around them as the first leaves of autumn began to fall, dancing through the air like silent witnesses to a conversation that had been waiting far too long to happen. Thomas glanced toward the old tree he had mentioned, its branches swaying gently in the autumn breeze. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, his fingers absently tracing the edge of the gravestone. Margaret followed his gaze, her mind swimming with questions she could barely contain. She wanted to demand answers, to force him to explain everything he knew, but a part of her feared what those answers might reveal. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely rising above the wind. "Emily, she had a way of seeing the world that was different from most people. She used to say that there were two sides to everything, what people showed on the outside, and what they kept hidden deep inside. She always felt like she was stuck between those two sides, never quite able to bridge the gap." He hesitated, his expression growing pained. "I think that's why she found comfort in this place. Here, she could let down the walls she built around herself, if only for a little while." Margaret listened, her throat tightening with unshed tears. She had always known Emily to be introspective, but she had never imagined that her granddaughter carried such a profound sense of isolation. "Did she ever tell you why?" Margaret asked, her voice cracking with the weight of her sorrow. "Why she felt that way?" Thomas looked away, his jaw clenched as if trying to hold back emotions that threatened to spill over. She said she felt like she was always letting people down," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She thought she wasn't strong enough, that she couldn't live up to what others expected of her. She used to talk about you, about how she wished she could make you proud, but that she always felt like she was falling short." Margaret felt a wave of anguish crash over her, almost knocking her off balance. Her hands trembled as she clutched her cane, her mind racing with memories of moments when she had been stern with Emily, of words she had spoken in the name of guidance, never realizing the impact they might have had. She had always thought she was doing what was best, but now those moments replayed in her mind like ghosts, haunting her with the possibility that she had pushed her granddaughter further away. "I never wanted her to feel like that," Margaret said, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. I thought I was helping her by being strong, by teaching her to face the world. But maybe all I did was make her feel like she couldn't be herself." She turned to Thomas, her expression desperate, as if he might have the power to rewrite the past. "Why didn't she tell me how she felt? Why did she let me go on thinking that everything was fine?" Thomas's expression softened, and he placed a hand on the cold stone of the headstone, as if seeking comfort from its solidity. "I don't think it was your fault, Margaret," he said gently. "She loved you. She said that so many times, but I think she was afraid that if she showed you the parts of herself that were hurting, it would only hurt you more. She thought she was protecting you, even if it meant keeping you at a distance." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the tears spill down her cheeks as the weight of Thomas's words settled into her heart. It was a bitter realization, but in some twisted way, she understood. She had been the same after Emily's death, bottling up her grief, refusing to show her pain to others, believing that silence would keep her strong. Now, faced with the truth of her granddaughter's struggles, she could see how that same silence had built walls between them, walls that neither had known how to break. She opened her eyes and looked at Thomas, her voice hoarse but determined. "Tell me more, Thomas, tell me what else," she said. She wiped her tears with a shaking hand, steeling herself for whatever he might reveal. "If she couldn't tell me when she was alive, then I'll listen to whatever you have to say now. I need to know everything." Thomas nodded, his gaze unwavering. "She wrote about you a lot," he said, reaching into the pocket of his coat and pulling out a small, worn notebook. Its cover was faded, the pages yellowed with time. And as he held it out to Margaret, her breath caught in her throat, she left this behind. She used to write here when she came to the cemetery. I think she wanted you to have it." Margaret took the notebook with trembling hands, staring at it as if it held the key to everything she had missed. She flipped open the first page, her eyes scanning the delicate handwriting that she recognized instantly as Emily's. The words were raw, filled with a vulnerability that Margaret had never seen before, as if each line was a window into her granddaughter's soul. One entry caught her eye, the date scrawled at the top marking a day just a few weeks before Emily's death. "I came here again today. I don't know why I keep coming back, maybe because it's the only place that feels real to me. The only place where I can breathe without feeling like I'm suffocating. I wish I could tell Grandma how much I miss her, even when she's right there. I wish she could see the parts of me that I'm too afraid to show." Margaret's breath hitched, and she clutched the notebook to her chest as if it could fill the hollow ache that had opened up inside her. She read the words again and again, as if by doing so she could somehow bring Emily back. Even for a moment, the pain was almost unbearable, but there was a strange comfort in it too. A sense that, finally, she was beginning to understand. "She missed you, Margaret," Thomas said softly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "She wanted to be closer to you, but she didn't know how, and now, I think she wanted you to find this, so that you could know the things she couldn't say out loud." Margaret looked up at him, her vision blurred with tears, and for the first time since this strange encounter began, she felt a glimmer of gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing this to me, for helping me see her again." Thomas offered a sad smile, the kind that spoke of understanding far beyond his years. "I'm just here to share her words, Margaret. The rest, that's between you and Emily." He glanced toward the tree once more, then back at Margaret, as if considering his next words carefully. "But there's still more you need to know, more that she wrote, things that she kept hidden until the end. If you're ready, I can show you." Margaret held the notebook tightly, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew that whatever came next might break her even more than she already felt, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Show me everything." Margaret's hands trembled as she held the notebook, her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. She felt the weight of Emily's words pressing against her, each page promising a new revelation, a new piece of a puzzle that she had never even known existed. Thomas stood beside her, silent now, watching her with an expression that seemed both compassionate and distant, as if he knew that this part of the journey was one she had to take alone. She flipped through the notebook, her eyes skimming over fragments of sentences, catching glimpses of Emily's innermost thoughts, bits of poetry, sketches of the ocean, and musings about life and loss. But then, one entry caught her attention. It was dated just a few days before Emily's passing, and the words seemed to leap off the page, each one cutting into Margaret's heart like a blade. "I wonder if she knows how much I needed her. I wish I could say it, but every time I try, the words get stuck in my throat. It's like there's this wall between us, one I built because I was scared she'd see how broken I am. I want to be strong for her, but I'm so tired of pretending. I'm so tired of feeling like I'm a disappointment." Margaret let out a choked sob, her vision blurring as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She clutched the notebook tighter, as if she could somehow reach back through time and hold Emily close, tell her that she was never a disappointment, that she was loved exactly as she was. But the words remained trapped in her own chest, as if they had come too late. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, forcing herself to read on, even though each word felt like it was tearing her apart. "I think about leaving sometimes. I think about what it would be like to just disappear, to fade away like the tide, to stop feeling so much. But then I think about her, about how she would look at me, and I can't do it. I can't hurt her like that, so I keep going. Even when it feels like I'm drowning, I keep going because I don't want her to think that I didn't try." Margaret's breath hitched, a sharp, painful sound in the stillness of the cemetery. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to consume her. She had known that Emily was struggling, of course. She had seen the sadness in her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her lips, but she had never imagined that the pain ran so deep, that her granddaughter had been fighting such dark thoughts, all while trying to shield her from the worst of it. She thought she had to protect me," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking as she turned to Thomas. "She thought that if she showed me how much she was hurting, I wouldn't be able to bear it, but I could have helped her." Her words dissolved into a sob, and she buried her face in her hands, feeling as if the weight of her regret might crush her where she stood. Thomas stepped closer, his expression softening. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light, but grounding. "She never blamed you, Margaret," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentle urgency. "She always spoke of you with love, even when she felt like she couldn't say the things she wanted to. She just didn't know how to let you in. She didn't know how to ask for help. Margaret shook her head, her voice raw with grief. But I should have known. I should have seen the signs. Should have. She broke off, her words lost in the tangle of guilt and sorrow that twisted inside her. She had spent so many sleepless nights after Emily's death, replaying every moment, every conversation, searching for the missed signals, the unspoken pleas for help, and now, faced with the reality of what Emily had been going through, those questions felt sharper than ever. Thomas let out a slow, steady breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was filled with a quiet strength. You couldn't have known, Margaret. She was determined to keep her pain hidden, but she left this for you because she wanted you to understand. She wanted you to know that, even when she couldn't show it, she cared about you deeply. That's why she wrote these words, because she hoped that, one day, you might find them, and you might understand that she never stopped loving you. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying, but there was a glimmer of something in her expression. Something like hope, fragile but persistent. Do you really think she wanted me to find this? She asked, her voice trembling with the weight of that hope. Do you think she knew that it might help me, forgive myself? Thomas hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the sky, where clouds gathered on the horizon like distant shadows. I think she knew that you deserved the chance to know her, even if it came too late, he said softly, and maybe she hoped that it would bring you a little bit of peace, even if it couldn't change what happened. Margaret clung to those words as if they were a lifeline, her hands trembling as she turned back to the notebook. She flipped to another page, her breath catching as she read the next entry, written in Emily's neat, slanted handwriting. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just too much sadness, too many feelings. I look at Grandma, and she's so strong, so put together, and I feel like a storm that doesn't know how to calm down. I wish I could tell her that I'm sorry for being this way, for not being the kind of granddaughter she deserves, but I'm scared that if I show her how broken I am, she'll think it's her fault. Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank down onto the bench beside the grave, clutching the notebook to her chest. Her tears flowed freely now, hot and unrelenting, and she let herself cry for everything she had lost, her granddaughter, her chance to understand her, and the years they had spent trapped behind walls of silence. She had always believed that her strength was a gift to Emily, that by being strong she could protect her from the harshness of the world, but now, she saw the unintended consequences of that strength. How it had made Emily feel even more isolated, more afraid to show her vulnerability. Thomas remained beside her, silent, a steady presence in the storm of her grief. He let her cry until her sobs began to quiet, and the weight of her sorrow settled into a dull ache. Then, he spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. She wasn't perfect, Margaret, and neither are you, but she wanted you to know that she loved you, even in her brokenness. She wanted you to know that she never stopped trying to reach you, even when she didn't know how. Margaret lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, and looked at the young man who had brought her so much pain and yet, so much understanding. Why did she trust you with all of this? She asked, her voice hoarse. Why did she think you could be the one to tell me these things? Thomas looked down, a shadow passing over his features. Because I was like her, he said quietly. I understood what it meant to carry something that felt too heavy to share. She saw that in me, and I saw it in her. That's why she told me her secrets, because she knew I'd understand. He paused, then met Margaret's gaze, his expression filled with a quiet determination, and because she believed that, maybe, through me, she could finally reach you. Margaret stared at him, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. For the first time, she began to see Thomas not just as a messenger, but as someone who had been a part of Emily's life in a way that she never could have imagined. And though it hurt, there was a strange comfort in knowing that Emily had found someone who understood her, even when Margaret couldn't. She reached out and took Thomas's hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. Thank you, she whispered, her voice rough with emotion, for being there for her when I couldn't be, for helping me understand what I couldn't see before. Thomas squeezed her hand gently, and for a moment, they shared a fragile, unspoken bond. Two people brought together by grief, but also by the hope that, somehow, understanding might bring a measure of healing. The wind swirled around them, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of rain, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt that the burden on her heart had grown just a little bit lighter. The rain began to fall softly, a light drizzle that misted the air and blurred the edges of the gravestones. Margaret didn't move from her spot on the bench, the drops soaking through her coat and dampening the pages of the notebook still open in her hands. She clutched the fragile book tightly, as if it held all the answers she had been searching for, as if letting it go might scatter Emily's words to the wind. Beside her, Thomas remained still, his coat pulled tight against the chill, but his gaze never left her face, watching every shift in her expression as she read on. Margaret turned to another entry, her breath hitching as she recognized the date. Emily's last birthday. She remembered the day clearly, the awkward lunch they'd shared, the way Emily had smiled politely as Margaret gave her a scarf, never quite meeting her eyes. At the time, Margaret had thought the day had been fine, quiet, perhaps, but not unhappy. Now, reading Emily's words, she realized how much she had missed. I turned 24 today. Grandma took me out to lunch at that cafe she likes. I smiled, I laughed, I tried to act like everything was okay, but inside, I felt like I was sinking, like I was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping through my fingers. I don't know why I couldn't just be honest with her, why I couldn't tell her that I'm scared of what the future holds, scared of feeling like I'll never be enough for her, scared that if she saw the real me, she'd be disappointed. Margaret's tears blurred the words, but she forced herself to keep reading, her lips moving silently. As she traced each line, she remembered how she had felt that day, frustrated by Emily's quietness, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. Now she saw that Emily had been just as lost, just as afraid of breaking the silence that stretched between them. It was a painful realization, but one that brought a strange clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from her memories. She was always so careful with her words, Margaret murmured, half to herself, half to Thomas, who listened in respectful silence. She never wanted to upset me, I thought she just needed space, time to come out of her shell, but now I see that she was hiding because she thought she had to protect me. She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. I thought I was the strong one, but she carried so much more than I ever realized. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the sadness that Margaret felt. In her own heart, she wanted to be strong for you, Margaret. She wanted to be someone you could be proud of, but I think, deep down, she always wished you could see through that strength, that you might see the parts of her that were scared and hurting. He paused, glancing down at the notebook in her hands. She wrote something else, something she didn't want anyone to see. I think it's in the back. Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering over the final pages of the notebook. A part of her was afraid of what she might find, afraid that it would only deepen the ache that had taken root in her chest, but she knew that turning away now would mean leaving the last pieces of Emily's story untold, and she couldn't bear the thought of that. Not when she had come this far. She flipped to the back of the notebook, her breath catching as she found a folded letter tucked between the last pages, sealed but unaddressed. With trembling hands, she opened the letter, the paper crackling softly in the quiet. Emily's handwriting, slightly shakier than in the previous entries, filled the page. Margaret's vision blurred as she began to read, her voice breaking as she spoke the words aloud. Dear Grandma, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give it to you, but I need to write it, even if it's just for myself. I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the times I shut you out, for all the times I couldn't find the words to tell you what I was going through. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you weren't enough for me, because you were. You always were. I want you to know that I love you, even when I don't know how to say it. I wish I could be braver, that I could look you in the eye and tell you everything, but I'm scared, Grandma. I'm scared that if you see all the darkness inside me, you'll think it's your fault, and it's not. It never was. You gave me everything you could, and I was lucky to have you. Please don't blame yourself for the things I couldn't change. If you're reading this, it means that I'm gone, and I'm so sorry for leaving you with all these questions. I hope that, somehow, you can find a way to forgive me, and to forgive yourself. I hope that you can remember the good things, too. The way you taught me to play cards, the way you would hum to yourself when you thought no one was listening, the way you always knew how to make me feel safe, even when I felt like the world was falling apart. I don't want you to be sad, Grandma. I know it's selfish to ask that, but I want you to find a way to be happy again, to find peace. I hope that when you think of me, you'll remember the times we laughed more than the times we cried, and I hope you'll know that, even when I was struggling, you were the reason I kept trying. I love you, always, Emily. The letter slipped from Margaret's fingers, fluttering to the ground like a fallen leaf, carried by the wind to rest beside the gravestone. She pressed her hand to her mouth, a broken sound escaping her as she doubled over, her body racked with sobs. Thomas reached down, picking up the letter with a careful touch, and placed it back in her hands, holding them together as if to give her strength. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, her tears mingling with the raindrops that dotted the paper. She had never known such pain, but in that pain, she also found something she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of knowing that Emily had loved her deeply, even through the distance and the silence. And she realized that this letter, though filled with sorrow, was also a gift, a chance to finally hear the words that had remained unspoken between them for so many years. I never thought I'd get a chance to hear her say those things," Margaret whispered, her voice raw with emotion. She looked up at Thomas, her expression a mixture of anguish and gratitude. "Thank you for bringing me this, for helping me see that she never stopped loving me, even when I thought she was slipping away." Thomas's gaze softened, and he offered her a small, sad smile. "She wanted you to know that, Margaret. She wanted you to understand that it was never about you not being enough for her. It was just the way she felt, the way she struggled." He hesitated, then added, "And she wanted you to know that, even in her hardest moments, she found comfort in the memories you shared." Margaret nodded slowly, her chest aching with the weight of everything she had learned, but there was also a sense of release, as if the years of unspoken grief had finally found a voice, carried by Emily's words and the quiet strength of the young man who had brought them to her. She reached out and placed a hand on Thomas's arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You've done more for me than you know, Thomas," she said, her voice steadier now, "and I think maybe you've helped Emily, too, wherever she is." Thomas looked at her, his expression turning wistful, and for a moment, Margaret thought she saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something like relief, or perhaps acceptance. "I hope so, Margaret," he replied quietly. "I hope that, somehow, she knows that you've found the peace she wanted you to have." He glanced up at the sky, where the rain had begun to lighten, and took a deep breath, as if savoring the cool air. "I think it's time for me to go, but I'll leave you with her words. I think you'll know what to do with them." Margaret watched as he turned to leave, his steps slow and deliberate as he walked away through the misty cemetery. She held the letter and the notebook close, feeling the weight of Emily's love and pain in her hands, and she knew that this moment, this final goodbye, would stay with her forever. But she also knew that it was not truly the end, for in the words that Emily had left behind, and in the memories that Thomas had brought to life, she had found a new way to hold on to her granddaughter, one that could never be taken from her. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, the cemetery shrouded in a veil of quiet as Margaret sat alone, the letter and notebook cradled in her lap. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air wash over her, the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves mingling with the soft murmur of the wind. The ache in her heart was still there, a constant reminder of everything she had lost, but there was also a new warmth, like a faint glow spreading through the darkness. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly remember the sound of Emily's laughter when she won at cards, the way she would tuck her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, the quiet moments they had shared over cups of tea, memories that had once felt too painful to revisit now seemed like treasures, each one a piece of the love they had shared, even when words had failed them. Margaret glanced down at the letter, tracing her fingers over Emily's handwriting, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. She knew that the pain would never fully go away, that the loss would always be a part of her, but now, there was something else alongside that pain. A sense of understanding, a knowledge that Emily's love had never truly been lost, it had simply been hidden, waiting to be found in the pages of a notebook and the quiet words of a young man who had somehow known exactly what she needed to hear. She looked toward the path where Thomas had disappeared, a faint smile touching her lips. She knew she might never see him again, that he was as much a part of this place as the wind in the trees, but she also knew that his presence had been a gift, a reminder that sometimes the things we leave behind find a way to reach those who need them most, and she hoped, wherever he went, that he carried a little bit of peace with him, just as he had brought to her. Margaret rose from the bench, feeling the stiffness in her joints but ignoring the discomfort. She walked slowly toward Emily's grave, kneeling down beside the headstone, her hands brushing away the raindrops that clung to its surface. For a moment, she simply rested her palm against the cool stone, closing her eyes and letting the quiet seep into her bones. Then, she took the notebook and placed it gently beside the grave, a small offering to the memory of the granddaughter she had loved so deeply. "I'll keep your words with me, Emily," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, "and I'll try to remember the things you wanted me to know, the laughter, the little moments, the love we both held back. I'll carry them with me, and I'll find a way to keep moving forward, I promise." She rose slowly, her knees protesting the movement, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. As she turned to leave, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the cemetery, turning the wet grass into a field of sparkling dew. Margaret paused, glancing back at the headstone one last time, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was as if the sun itself was offering a blessing, a promise that the days ahead might hold more light than she had dared to hope for. She walked back down the path, her cane tapping rhythmically against the gravel, each step carrying her further from the shadows of the past and closer to the promise of a new beginning. She didn't know what the future would hold. She knew there would be more lonely nights, more moments when the ache of loss would creep back in, but she also knew that she was no longer alone in that pain. Emily's words, and the memories they shared, would be a light to guide her through the darkest moments. As she reached the edge of the cemetery, Margaret paused one last time, looking back at the place that had once felt like a prison of sorrow but had become a place of revelation and connection. She raised her hand in a silent farewell, not to the grave, but to the part of herself that had been trapped in regret and self-blame for so long. She felt the wind pick up again, swirling around her like a gentle embrace, and she took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs with the crisp, fresh air of the autumn morning. Margaret turned and walked away, her steps sure and steady, the sun warming her back as she moved forward into the day. She knew that the journey of healing was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it, one step at a time, one memory at a time, with the knowledge that love, no matter how tangled and imperfect, could endure even beyond the veil of loss.